He called her stupid in front of everyone. The line lands like cut crystal on a ballroom floor. Glasses stop mid-raise. Conversations drop out. Phones tilt, recording a man who has spent his life managing other people's reputations as if they were balance sheets, and who, in a single sentence, misjudged the arithmetic of a very different ledger. It happened at the plaza, at a fundraiser that read like a ledger of old money and new deals. The topic on stage was the Federal Reserve and the stubborn question of whether a yield curve inversion, a technical sign markets watch closely, meant recession risk or a buying opportunity. People leaned in. The room smelled of perfume and polished wood. Candles blurred the chandeliers into warm coins. Gregory Hayes, the scion who had inherited a well-known family office and the kind of access that gets CEOs private tables at charity dinners, was in the center of a small cluster by the bar when the conversation about rates turned into a correction. Wendy Hayes, professionally known as Wendy Anderson, had offered a quiet point about duration and capital allocation. Gregory, impatient and loud, interrupted. "That's stupid," he said, according to the video clip that would later circulate. "You don't even really work in finance. You're wrong." There are moments when a personality shows you the shape of itself. That sentence did that for everyone in the room. The clip, 3 seconds, caught on a phone, squares the moment. Gregory's hand chopping the air. A ripple of surprise through those nearest. Wendy's face composed but distant. The small, abrupt pivot of a woman who had the option to argue and chose not to. She stepped away. She walked to the coat room. She texted her sister, "I am free." The message, short and private at first, later read like a seal on a plan. By sunrise the next day, the video had been watched millions of times, threaded through feeds, captioned and recaptioned. The phrase, "he called her stupid," trended. Journalists clipped it. Op-eds framed it. Commentators weighed in on marriage and manners. For some, the story was about marital rudeness. For others, it was about the particular sting of a black woman being publicly dismissed in a space that has historically been inhospitable. For Wendy, it was, crucially, the opening of a window she had been working toward for years. If this clip was Act Zero, the instant the rest of the story became possible, what followed was not a spontaneous revenge opera. It was the flip of well-placed, legal, and financial switches she had quietly set up while the world thought she was merely in the orbit of someone else's wealthy surname. If this story pulled people in, it was because it combined what modern audiences are especially drawn to: spectacle and the very plain arithmetic of proof. The spectacle gave attention, the proof did damage. If you want more investigative narratives like this, hit subscribe.
We've put resources in the description: financial independence checklists and hotlines for people dealing with coercive or emotional abuse. Stay with this one. The Plaza clip was only the immediate shock. To understand why a 3-second soundbite could unmoor a presidency of privilege, you have to go back to how Wendy and Gregory came together, and to the pattern the clip finally exposed. They met 8 years earlier at a Miami conference that draws investors and portfolio strategists. She was standing in for a colleague who'd canceled. He was introduced through a mutual acquaintance. He was polished, generous in the kind of ways that accompany money. Great dinners, last-minute tables at sold-out restaurants, gifts that carried other people's burdens so recipients felt unbesieged. And she liked that he made room for the small gestures that make time away from work easier, not showier. He had a family fortune. She had a resume that read like diligence. Harvard Business School, followed by a fast rise through the ranks at Evergreen Capital, a firm where she eventually became managing director. At a glance, people paired them like 2 lines on a spreadsheet: capital and competence. What the spreadsheet missed was the difference between inherited wealth and earned authority. Wendy's path in finance was deliberate. She earned a Harvard MBA, then joined Evergreen, where she built teams and led strategies that, according to reporting and public filings, grew into a slate of portfolios overseeing approximately $4.8 billion in assets under management. AUM, or assets under management, is simply the total market value of investments a manager oversees. Her reported compensation, according to documents and reporting made public later, placed her in a bracket that rivaled many public company CEOs, numbers that surprised those who had previously assumed her status was defined by marriage. Inside the marriage, however, recognition did not mirror those figures. Friends and colleagues who later spoke with reporters described a pattern that was subtle and cumulative. There were small corrections at dinners, a feminist argument interrupted with "let me explain," a public restatement of a technical point as if she had misspoken, social media moments where he would introduce her in a way that framed her achievements as if they were accessories to his. Once, on a panel, a moderator deferred to Gregory's opinion on a portfolio allocation problem and joked about asking the wife for the family take, an apparent effort at levity that landed differently for those watching. Wendy sought help at a point the patterns felt regular enough to threaten her sense of self. She and Gregory attended couples counseling with Dr. Helen Ross, a licensed therapist not unfamiliar with couples in the public eye. There, records later show, she raised the weariness of constant correction and a desire to maintain professional boundaries.
According to sessions described in documents and by sources, Gregory initially engaged, then withdrew. The same people who described the early courting gifts and polished manners also noted a stubbornness that did not translate well to humility. The tipping point for Wendy, according to reporting and documents she would later provide to a journalist, was a fight in 2021. It was more than a fight about manners. It was about control. She recognized in a moment that public dignity alone was not protection. Over the next several months, she quietly put measures in place. The measures were not dramatic. They were careful, legal and financial steps. She opened accounts under her own name in trusted institutions. She moved assets into vehicles that she controlled. She worked with an attorney to amend existing agreements. Documents made available to reporters show a prenup amendment dated March 15, 2021, that redefined certain marital property arrangements and clarified control over separate accounts. Those documents would later be central to a corporate and legal strategy that, in the narrative's later beats, limited the ability of others to weaponize private finances. None of that preparation involved a desire to humiliate Gregory. It involved a refusal to be surprised. People who knew Wendy professionally described her as meticulous. She treated portfolios like foundations, said one former colleague who asked to remain anonymous to speak freely. You don't build a $4.8 billion book without anticipating storms. Those who worked with her noted that her teams returned results that made clients stick. It's one thing to inherit a name and another to deliver monthly performance that keeps institutions invested. Friends also remember her as someone who thought in long arcs. She planned vacations around quiet reading lists. She built professional relationships carefully, networking not for the Instagram opportunities but for substantive collaborations. That distinction mattered. The title on a social invitation or a guest list could be owned. The respect of the market and of clients had to be earned. In spaces where identity and authority intersect, rooms where fewer than 10% of senior portfolio managers are women, and a smaller portion of those women are black, the presumption of invisibility tends to accrete like dust. Wendy, quietly, was sweeping it away with statements of ownership that looked boring in the short term, bank account applications, an amendment witnessed by a lawyer, but which would later be decisive. When the Plaza clip spread, a number of reactions happened almost at once. The gaffe, if it could be called that, was small enough to be a social moment, large enough to be a legal and reputational one. For a man whose public image had been carefully cultivated, the optics were immediate. A billionaire-sized man dismissing the expertise of a woman, his wife, in a public room of peers.
For many viewers, including journalists who would later investigate, the comment was proof of an old pattern. For others, it was a moment to demand context. That context arrived in the form of documents and sourcing, the sort of material journalists know how to amplify and courts know how to respect. Sarah Collins, an investigative reporter who crossed paths with Wendy in college and who had by then developed a beat focused on money and power, saw the clip and did what good reporters do. She asked questions. She reached out to Wendy with a direct message that read, "Can I help?" It was the kind of plain language that invited evidence rather than spectacle. Wendy's reply was cautious but not evasive. She was a professional whose life had been divided along two axes: public social belonging and private financial autonomy. She had deliberately kept those axes separate, in part to protect herself and in part to keep a clean professional record untainted by whispers that could be used against her. But the clip changed the calculus. A public insult, amplified by platforms that reward outrage, could be followed by private erosion, access demands, attempts to rewrite narratives that would matter to boards and clients. Here was the moment when private preparation could meet public vindication. Over the next 48 hours, emails and drops happened with the care of a well-executed trade. Wendy provided a packet, corroborating texts that showed repeated belittling in public settings, account statements that traced transfers to her personally controlled vehicles, the prenup amendment, stamped and dated March 15, 2021, that shifted control over certain assets, notes from counseling sessions that indicated patterns of gaslighting reported to a therapist. Sarah began to stitch the facts into a frame that did not simply make the clip into clickbait, but instead revealed a sequence where patterns of dismissal were tied to actual attempts to control professional recognition and financial freedom. It's important to be precise about numbers here, because the public's shock later hinged on them. Reporting published by Bloomberg and other outlets, and documents provided to reporters show that Wendy's portfolio responsibilities at Evergreen encompassed approximately $4.8 billion in assets under management. Her reported compensation, according to the same reporting and company disclosures that sources shared, was roughly $2.4 million annually, figures that, when juxtaposed with a casual dismissal at a bar, reframed the moment from marital rudeness to a public diminishment of a highly compensated professional. The reporting did not invent an argument about gender or race. It supplied the arithmetic that made viewers reconsider assumptions.
In the months that followed, commentators and advocates reflected on how automatic assumptions about a woman's role, especially a black woman's role in finance, can be compounded by a public persona that relies on her as a social accessory rather than as a peer. Wendy's case became a touchstone for those conversations, not because it was unique. Too many women, particularly women of color, recount similar moments, but because it combined visible evidence and intangible experiences into a single, shareable narrative. Even before Sarah published her piece, echoes of accountability began reverberating where reputations really matter, in the wallets of clients and in the meetings of boards. Within hours of the clip's spread, posts from unnamed former employees and colleagues began to surface. Daniel Foster, a former portfolio associate, wrote a LinkedIn post that read, in part, like many professional reckonings, "We didn't speak up then, but we saw the pattern." Others, Lisa Martinez, Ramon Garcia, a handful of people who had worked in proximate roles, left public comments about a workplace culture that sometimes tolerated public belittling tied to status. Those posts signaled that beyond the marriage, there were corporate contexts in which Gregory's behavior no longer seemed merely personal. Boards, for their part, often act when reputational risk becomes a client experience issue. The first stirrings of worry were measurable. Social metrics ticked, clients quietly called relationship managers to say they were monitoring the situation, and a few institutional investors sent thinly veiled notes asking for assurance. Hayes Capital, Gregory's family firm, had long positioned itself as steady and discreet. A video of its leader undermining a senior peer threatened that posture. Still, institutions do not move on clips alone. They move on evidence, timelines, and the math of potential asset redemptions. If one client moved billions, it would matter to quarterly figures. If many moved smaller sums, it could signal a trend. In reporting that followed, sources say the firm began to run contingency plans, lists of alternative messaging, client outreach scripts, and emergency board calls. For Gregory, who had long been comfortable in rooms where power diluted memory, the idea that the world could now summon documentation he had assumed private was likely disorienting. Wendy's immediate public posture was not theatrical. She did not storm back into the ballroom for a rebuttal. She refused, at least initially, to allow the story to be only about a moment of humiliation. Instead, she steered toward what she knew best, records and evidence. The next move was to assemble auditors of truth rather than pundits of outrage. That assembly took the form of a single box of facts and the people who would confirm them. Sarah began to compare dates. A legal letter tucked into a folder referenced the March 15, 2021 amendment. Bank account numbers matched names.
Performance records confirmed client retention and returns. Witnesses, people who had worked with Wendy on deals, confirmed that she had been the architect of certain strategies. Small things added up. Calendar entries, emails confirming client calls, onboarding documents that listed her as lead portfolio manager. Each piece alone was explainable. Together, they formed a ledger that contradicted the barroom narrative. There was also a moral hazard worth naming. Public shaming can be hollow without recourse. Documentation is what turns an embarrassing clip into an argument that institutions and courts can act on. Wendy's preparation and her willingness to share it with a journalist turned the viral moment into potential accountability. By the time she and Sarah agreed to proceed, the question had shifted from what happened in the plaza to what will institutions do when a clip, a prenup amendment, and an AUM figure all point to misjudgment. It is one thing for a husband to insult his wife in public. It is another for market participants to interpret that insult as evidence of a managerial culture that may be at odds with fairness and fiduciary responsibility. As people began to triangulate these elements, the narrative opened into more complicated terrain. There were the personal costs, how Wendy prepared her children for public scrutiny, how she managed the exhaustion of repeated explanations, and the legal calculus. Would attorneys use the documentation to resist attempts to erase her professional identity? Her attorney, Linda Bennett, advised caution and precision. Public statements, the legal counsel advised, would be factual and sparing. Even before the first story hit the press, Gregory's immediate instinct was to control the narrative. He reached for the usual tools: a carefully worded social media statement emphasizing a misunderstanding, a defensive interview offer to a favorable broadcast, and, according to sources tracking the exchanges, lawyers' letters that suggested potential litigation over the dissemination of private messages. The strategy was standard: deflect, deny if necessary, and mobilize institutional sockets that could protect his image. But the calculus had changed. The world that consumes a 3-second clip is not the same world that reads a box of corroborating documents and connects the dots. The combination of spectacle and substantiation can prompt movements in places that money normally insulates: the boardroom and the client ledger. Already, whispered calls with investors had begun. At this point in the story, the scene is set for the next act. We have a viral clip that crystallized long patterns, we have a woman who quietly amassed agency through legal and financial steps, and we have a journalist willing to assemble public evidence into a narrative that matters to institutions.
The question becomes not just whether the public will be outraged, but whether that outrage, grounded in documentation, will translate into concrete consequences: client redemptions, board scrutiny, and legal maneuvers that might alter careers and corporate governance. But before any of that resolves, there is a cascade of small choices that will determine the shape of what comes next: which documents journalists release, which clients whisper their concerns, which board members vote to raise a formal inquiry. In the quiet hours before a story publishes, lawyers draft statements, PR teams rehearse messages, and a single newsroom decides the order of facts that will shape public perception. And Wendy, who had spent years making contingency plans in quiet rooms, now faces a choice that every person who steps into public scrutiny must face: to let the world narrate her, or to narrate herself through the ledger she compiled. She chose the ledger. The rest depended on what others did with it. When Sarah's story went live, it read like a careful audit of a 3-second humiliation. The article led with the clip from the plaza, then layered in the evidence Wendy had handed over: the March 15, 2021 prenup amendment, counseling notes, account statements, emails that placed Wendy at the center of client calls and portfolio decisions. The piece quoted former colleagues, linked to calendar entries, and cited reporting that Wendy's management responsibilities covered roughly $4.8 billion in assets under management, and that her reported compensation was in the neighborhood of $2.4 million a year. Each link, each document, tightened the frame. This was not an outburst against the wife. It was an affront to a professional with measurable responsibility and market influence. The headline, as headlines do, made the case bluntly: the billionaire who had called his wife stupid had been publicly wronged by arithmetic. The reaction did what good reporting hopes for and what reputations fear: it moved institutions. Calls began at odd hours. Relationship managers at large pension plans and endowments wanted to know what their counterparts were hearing. One institution placed Hayes Capital on a watch list, not because they had decided to pull money immediately, but because the optics mattered to clients and trustees. Compliance officers asked to see governance materials. One large client, according to sources, flagged a contingent conversation about potential redemption if Hayes Capital could not satisfactorily address leadership risk. In money management, perception can influence flows as quickly as performance. On the firm side, the first response was the defensive choreography executives have rehearsed for harder days. An internal memo, later leaked to the press, urged staff to refrain from commenting publicly, to direct all inquiries to a single spokesperson, and to assume that every internal email could be shared outside the firm.
The board called an emergency meeting. In some quarters, that move signaled more panic than control. In others, it was steady governance doing what governance must do when reputational risk bleeds into client retention and regulatory scrutiny. Gregory's immediate PR playbook followed the familiar arc: a short social media post calling the exchange a misunderstanding, an interview bid to a sympathetic network where he emphasized family and regret, and a terse legal letter that threatened action against anyone publishing what he called private communications. He aimed to convert outrage into sympathy. Instead, the leaks and Sarah's reporting layered the clip with fact. The video showed an interruption. The documents showed a career. The two together changed what observers called the narrative calculus. Within days, more voices surfaced. Former employees posted reflections on LinkedIn and Medium. Daniel Foster, who had worked under Wendy in a junior role, posted that, "We knew she ran the strategies, we just weren't the ones to say so publicly." Lisa Martinez wrote about moments she had seen where Gregory would reframe a client meeting's results as if they had been guided by his commentary, downplaying the analysts and portfolio managers who'd done the work. Ramon Garcia posted timelines of emails that placed Wendy as the lead on client onboarding. The pattern was not of one grand conspiracy, but of repetitive small acts that, when aggregated, suggested a culture that allowed a senior partner to publicly recenter credit and at times to diminish women who worked beside him. At the same time, the counseling notes Sarah had reviewed, summarized, not sensationalized, showed a pattern Dr. Helen Ross later described to reporters in clinical terms, a recurring dynamic of correction and public minimization. Ross emphasized the emotional consequences, not to litigate Gregory's psyche, but to explain the steady pressure that erodes professional confidence when repeated in public forums. She did not diagnose, she described patterns: withdrawal, a refusal to accept peer expertise in mixed settings, and the toll those patterns exact on a partner's work identity. The firm's board convened multiple times in a week. Minutes, some portions of which were later reported, showed an urgent tone: client inquiries, media exposure, reputational risk that could translate into asset outflows. Board members asked for a legal and governance review. They asked for an independent communications audit. They debated whether an internal reprimand, a public apology, or a leadership change was the prudent course. The calculation for boards is always a mix of fiduciary duty and optics. A leader's misstep is less about the private exchange than about how that misstep threatens clients' trust. Then the market began to whisper. A handful of institutional investors increased monitoring. One mid-size institutional client requested additional reporting and a face-to-face briefing.
Another asked for a timeline of governance reforms. These moves were not headlines themselves, but they are the slower, quieter levers that make senior executives and boards take deeper action. Money moves in markets, and meetings about money move faster when trustees worry about reputational spillover into performance. Gregory did not only try to manage perceptions, he attempted to control access. According to reporting and court filings later made public, there were attempts to access certain accounts and documents, inquiries that Wendy's legal team described as overbroad. There were a few tense building visits. Neighbors reported seeing him arrive unannounced at residential entrances, though those accounts were not presented as criminal. Lawyers for both sides exchanged letters about privacy and access. The tenor of those letters, reported excerpts showed, was litigious. Some threatened defamation suits. Others insisted on non-disclosure of sensitive personal documents. Yet the public file, Sarah's article, the bank statements, the prenup amendment, had already shifted public attention away from private recrimination and toward governance and evidence. Sarah's piece prompted regulators and clients to ask questions at a scale Hayes Capital had not publicly faced in years. The board engaged outside counsel. An audit was initiated to determine whether governance failures had contributed to improper attribution of performance or to a culture that marginalized certain professionals. The possibility that institutional clients could view leadership missteps as a risk to the stewardship of assets became a live scenario. Boards respond most decisively when revenue and legal exposure converge with reputational damage. Meanwhile, Gregory moved to contain the legal fallout by offering an out-of-court settlement that, according to sources, included a cash payment and a standard non-disparagement clause, language that commonly accompanies attempts to draw a veil over disputes. Linda Bennett, Wendy's attorney, counseled against a quick headline settlement that would include an NDA. Anonymity is not accountability, she told reporters later, without disclosing privileged strategy. Wendy, through her counsel, rejected the initial offer. Her rejection was not performative, it was strategic. Documents she had signed, accounts and the prenup amendment, had created buffers she intended to rely on if the conflict escalated. A low-dollar settlement paired with a gag order would have silenced the public thread but left private leverage intact for others. Wendy chose instead to press a path that asserted documented truth. The war of messages intensified. Gregory agreed to a televised interview in which he expressed regret and framed the incident as an unfortunate moment. He said in a clip that circulated widely, "I regret my words. I should have handled that differently."
But for many viewers, regret issued in a soundbite lacked the specificity that evidence provided. Social feeds that had once focused on the 3-second insult now scrolled documents, timelines, and reporting that placed Wendy's work in plain view. The pressure built toward a formal governance intervention. The board formed a special committee to review leadership and reputational risk, standard procedure in high-stakes situations. Leaked minutes, later reported, showed the committee considered scenarios: retention, censure, forced resignation, or termination. A minority of board members favored a reprimand and coaching arrangement. A majority eventually leaned toward a trustee-like assessment that leadership change was necessary to restore client confidence. The tipping point was not one thing. It was a cascade. Press attention, client probes, evidence of misallocation of credit, and a calculation that leaving Gregory in place posed a material business risk.
When the board voted to remove Gregory as CEO, reporting made it clear that the decision was as much about clients as it was about conduct. The board's official statement, distributed after the vote, cited a commitment to preserving client trust and adherence to governance standards, and announced that a search for interim leadership was underway. The decision surprised some observers and validated others who had argued that leadership accountability must be enforced when private behavior jeopardizes public stewardship. Gregory issued a brief apology, saying, "I am sorry for my words and for the pain they caused," and pledged to cooperate with any transitions. Whether that apology would satisfy clients or colleagues was another matter. The removal was not a legal judgment, it was a governance one. It did not adjudicate private marital disputes, but for many it represented a material consequence for behavior previously tolerated or minimized. The board had acted on the ledger, on evidence that showed pattern, risk, and client concern. Parallel to the corporate drama, Wendy's legal team moved in the family arena. Court filings made public show that on March 23 she filed for divorce. The filing, which was reported by multiple outlets and later confirmed by court documents, cited irreconcilable differences. Linda Bennett stood at a podium at a press conference arranged to minimize theater and maximize clarity. She read a short statement on Wendy's behalf, concise, factual, and centered on protection. "Wendy seeks a fair resolution that protects her family and preserves the professional work she has built," Bennett said. The attorney declined to litigate in the press, but noted that Wendy would pursue her legal rights under the amended agreement and that any offers conditioned on non-disclosure would be evaluated in light of the public record. Wendy's statement, read by her counsel rather than delivered from the podium herself, was understated by design.
"I will not be defined by a brief moment. My responsibility is to my children and to the clients and teams I serve," the statement said, according to reporting. It emphasized stability and the need to protect children from public spectacle. Her request for privacy in the immediate period was granted by the press, in the sense that courtroom filings and legal documents, rather than sensationalized interviews, became the public record. The divorce process later involved negotiated terms that sources described as leveraging the prenup amendment's protections. Reporting suggests Wendy secured primary custody arrangements and financial provisions that respected the agreements she had put in place. Those outcomes, as the files show, were consistent with the legal instruments she had quietly assembled years earlier. The settlement also included financial terms reported by media outlets. Production should verify exact figures before publication, but the public filings and reporting made it clear that the prenup amendment limited the volatility of negotiations, and that Wendy did not sign a blanket NDA in exchange for a minimal sum. The press conference after the court filing was short. A camera captured a composed Wendy as her attorney read the prepared language. She did not use the event for a wider denunciation. Her posture was calculated: control the record, protect family privacy, and let the public, the market, and the law do their work. Around her, friends and family described a woman who had moved from shock to strategy to quiet resilience. That resilience played out publicly in the weeks that followed. Offers arrived from several large asset managers, according to reporting. Clients and colleagues reached out. Within months, Wendy, who had begun using her maiden name professionally again, accepted a senior role at a major global asset manager, a step that reporting described as a career rebound both in responsibility and compensation. She took with her the teams who had trusted her leadership and over time reclaimed the public narrative. She was not merely the wife of, she was a portfolio architect whose work produced measurable results. Her new role was framed as part professional homecoming and part strategic move. It brought a mandate: lead strategies, diversify teams, and build structures that prevent attribution theft. Colleagues who had followed her career noted that she accepted the position not simply for higher pay, but for the ability to shape governance and mentorship programs within a larger institutional structure. That was meaningful for others watching the story unfold, especially women who had hesitated to mobilize because they feared the costs of exposure. The corporate fallout extended beyond Hayes Capital. Several firms reviewed HR policies, especially around public-facing events, attribution of credit, and protocols for reporting interpersonal misconduct that had professional consequences.
Some firms rolled out refreshed bias training. Others developed clearer pathways for senior and junior staff to document contributions to client work. HR leaders, once reluctant to wade into marital disputes, found themselves updating policies to better account for reputational risk born from private behavior. The industry conversation shifted from isolated anecdotes to systemic remedy. It's less about shaming individuals than about building systems that prevent these patterns from going unnoticed, one head of talent told a trade publication. The ripple effect ran deeper. Women in finance began to speak more publicly about the small violences of being interrupted, corrected, and cast as a social ornament in rooms where their expertise mattered. Some cited Wendy's story as impetus to create financial plans that separated personal and professional assets. Community groups and nonprofits reported an uptick in inquiries from women seeking guidance on asset protection, prenups, and exit planning. Financial planners who specialized in executive risk noticed an increase in consultations. The story, in effect, normalized an idea that had been technical and private: financial autonomy is a form of safety.
Journalists and advocates debated the role of race in the narrative with caution and care. Wendy's identity as a black woman in a sector where senior roles are disproportionately held by white men made the insult feel different to many observers. It was not just marital rudeness, pundits argued, but a reflection of broader patterns of invisibility and tokenization. Commentators, some scholars, some practitioners, called for more rigorous inclusion efforts and for boards to measure diversity at senior investment decision-making levels, not just in entry-level pipelines. The conversation was not reducible to one moment. It added a layer of urgency to long-standing discussions about representation and bias in investment leadership. For Gregory, the consequences were multiple. He faced boardroom exile, reputational diminution, and the legal and financial realities of a separation. He issued an apology and participated in some media engagements aimed at explaining himself. Those appearances rarely quieted criticism. Public sentiment was varied. Some defended his right to a private life. Others argued the public consequences were proportional to the documented behavior. The key point for observers was that systems, boards, clients, media responded when private actions intersected with public risk and when evidence substantiated patterns. There were inevitably voices that urged caution about online shaming and about the dangers of rendering complex domestic situations into a social media morality play. That critique had merit, but what distinguished this case, repeatedly emphasized by journalists and governance professionals, was that Wendy had not relied on spectacle, she had relied on evidence. The video generated attention.
The documents generated consequence. The difference matters in a world where virality can quickly become rumor without corroboration. Wendy's public role after the legal resolution was a study in deliberate visibility. She accepted invitations to speak about professional resilience, financial planning, and mentorship. She emphasized practical steps: keep separate accounts where appropriate, document contributions to deals, consider legal protections like prenups not as betrayals but as contingency tools. She spoke candidly about the toll of public scrutiny, the confusion it can bring to children, and the importance of legal counsel that understands both personal and professional domains. Her counsel, Linda Bennett, later described the case as an example of how preparation changes outcomes. "This was never about punishing a husband," Bennett said in an interview. "It was about protecting a career and a family through legal and financial means that are available to anyone who prepares." That language, practical, non-vengeful, became a refrain among financial advisors and legal practitioners who began offering workshops and resources targeted at women in high-visibility roles. Wendy also turned part of the experience into public service. She helped establish a small fellowship that funded financial planning seminars for mid-career women in finance, with a focus on asset protection and governance literacy. The initiative aimed to lower the activation energy for women who wanted to prepare contingency plans but did not know where to start. It was practical: workshops, template documents, and pro bono consultations with attorneys. It was also symbolic, a channel that converted a private crisis into public education. In boardrooms and in client meetings across the industry, governance models subtly shifted. Institutional investors asked for clearer documentation of who was driving strategy. Audit committees expanded conversations about reputational risk and how interpersonal conduct at the top can leak into client retention metrics. HR departments codified ways for professionals to report instances where public diminishment coincided with professional harm. Those changes were not universal nor instantaneous, but they were measurable. New policies, updated training modules, and revised escalation pathways appeared on company intranets. The social ripple extended to the small, quiet victories that rarely make headlines. Junior analysts who had long felt their contributions were subsumed by louder voices reported greater confidence in documenting their work. Mentorship programs emphasized shared authorship of client deliverables. Women in teams petitioned for clearer attribution on performance reports. For many, the story of one public insult became the lever that made private conversations about fairness more tolerable and more actionable. Throughout, Wendy's choices were oriented by a principle that had guided her from the start: agency.
She had not wanted spectacle. She had wanted the ability to choose dignity over silence. That preparation made possible a set of options she could exercise when the moment came. The lesson resonated beyond finance. It was about contingency plans, legal safeguards, and the quiet ledger of documents that can turn a moment of humiliation into a field of evidence. Months after the Plaza clip, when people asked about the outcome, they often expected a dramatic revenge or a courtroom spectacle. Instead, they found a different arc: an initial humiliation that became a catalyst for documentation-led accountability, institutional recalibration, and a public conversation about representation and professional visibility. The boardroom, the court filing, and the market flows were not moral absolutes. They were pragmatic responses to a confluence of evidence and risk. Wendy's professional rebound was itself instructive. She returned to work under her maiden name, accepted a role that placed her at the center of investment decision-making again, and set new expectations for how credit would be documented and shared. Her teams reported higher retention and increased client inflows under her leadership. Those outcomes, reported by sources and market notices, suggested that competence, when paired with clear documentation and a supportive governance environment, remains the best antidote to marginalization. In the months and years that followed, the story's most enduring effect was not merely that a billionaire had insulted his wife and that her salary shocked the public. It was that the episode illuminated how invisibility accrues in professional spaces and how deliberate, mundane acts, opening accounts, amending agreements, preserving emails and calendar entries, create a scaffold for agency. Wendy's preparation changed the stakes. The viral moment provided attention, documentation provided accountability. There were small human fragments people remembered. The text Wendy sent her sister in the coat room, "I am free," became less a taunt than a note of relief. Whether freedom meant legal separation, professional reclamation, or simply the release from constant diminution depended on whom you asked. For Wendy, freedom meant the ability to make decisions for her children and her career without being gaslit into acquiescence. The industry shifts that followed were imperfect. Not every firm updated its policies. Not every board took the same view. But the case set a precedent for how evidence can catalyze corporate and social responses. It also normalized a set of conversations about prenups without stigma, about separating personal and professional finances for protection, and about how representation at senior levels matters not only symbolically but operationally. In public discussions that followed, commentators often returned to a single arithmetic that had reframed the story from a private insult to a public question. The math didn't lie.
When a woman's resume shows leadership over billions of dollars and compensation commensurate with that role, a 3-second dismissal no longer looks like a private misstep. It looks like a miscalculation by someone who mistook social stature for professional authority. That miscalculation proved consequential. At the end of the sequence, the legal and corporate resolutions were less dramatic than many had expected and more permanent in the quiet ways that matter. Documented settlements that respected negotiated terms, a governance change at a firm that prioritized client reassurance, and a professional comeback for a manager who had long done the work. Wendy's decision to refuse a quick gag and cash offer, to rely on a prenup amendment stamped March 15, 2021, and to let documented evidence lead the response, shaped the arc of accountability. The story's larger moral is not the spectacle of a billionaire's slip of the tongue. It is the lesson that preparation creates options. For anyone in a precarious professional position, especially women and people of color in fields that have historically minimized their contributions, the practical steps Wendy took are replicable. Separate financial accounts where appropriate. Keep meticulous records of client interactions and deal ownership. Seek legal advice about prenuptial protections if you have assets or expect public scrutiny. Build a network of corroborating colleagues. These are not glamorous moves, but they are powerful. There is also a communal lesson. When one person's documented experience prompts institutions to examine their policies, the ripple can create safer spaces for others. That is what happened here. A viral clip made public the problem. Evidence made it actionable. Institutional responses, however imperfect, began to change the landscape. Women who once feared that speaking up would cost them careers found pathways to protect themselves and their work. Wendy did not walk away gloating. She returned to work, to family life, and to a public role that included mentoring others. She established a small fellowship to help mid-career women with financial planning and governance literacy. She accepted that public scrutiny would accompany a higher profile, but used that visibility to advocate for structural changes that help professionals document and defend their contributions. In interviews, she said she hoped the story would be a cautionary tale and a resource. Caution about complacency, resource for action. Gregory's public apology, his removal from the firm, and the legal separation were consequential. They were not theatrical exorcisms of private fault lines. They were the results of multiple actors responding to documented fact. That is the point that mattered most to those who followed closely. Evidence organizes accountability in ways that rumor cannot.
There is an irony here the public appreciated. A man who had spent a lifetime negotiating reputations misjudged one simple reality. Skill, demonstrated over time and measured in clients and returns, is not something you erase with a flippant dismissal. When the math and the documents lined up, the spectacle became a vector for accountability rather than an endpoint for shame. If you think this story matters, share it. Stories like these gain force when they catalyze changes, not only in headlines, but in policies, in mentorship, and in the practical tools people use to protect careers and families. Below this video, we've linked resources, a financial independence checklist, guidance on prenuptial planning, and hotlines and support for anyone dealing with coercive or emotional abuse. If Wendy's experience speaks to you or someone you know, the description has links to places that can help. In the end, the most lasting images are quiet ones. A woman who walked out of a ballroom without spectacle, who later walked into a courtroom and a boardroom with evidence at her side, and who reclaimed a professional identity that had always been hers. The viral clip recorded an insult. The documents recorded a life's work. The choice she made, to prepare rather than perform, changed everything.